equals the dim light flickered persistently in the cramped room. The shadows it cast were long and intertwined with the lonely remnants of a life that had once brimmed with vivid promise and potential. Dust motes danced ever so gracefully in the narrow beam that sneaked through the closed blinds, with each particle suspended in a state of timelessness, as if time itself held its breath. A half-empty wine bottle rested precariously on the table, beside a crumpled receipt from a long-forgotten restaurant, remnants of an evening hurriedly recalled, yet hardly cherished. In the center of it all, Elinor sat, staring blankly at the wall before her, her face a silent testament to the enormous burden she bore, an ache carved deeply from the twisted roots of regret and unforeseen consequences. Outside, life continued unabated, unfazed by the turmoil raging within her. The cheerful laughter of children playing drifted through the window, buoying the air with an illusion of innocence and joy that felt utterly unattainable. She could never belong to that carefree joy again, nor could she reconcile with the echoes of her past that reminded her of everything she had so painfully chosen to leave behind. Vibrant colors that struck her heart like a cruel artist's brush against the grayscale pain that now dominated her soul. Sharp and jagged fragments of memories often nudged at the edges of her consciousness, insistent and unyielding. Almost an entire year ago, everything had spiraled devastatingly off course one fateful Tuesday afternoon. A promise was made beneath the indifferent sky, and little did she know that this fleeting moment, this one misplaced choice, would dismantle her entire existence piece by agonizing piece, leaving behind a landscape strewn with the wreckage of her decision. The creeping realization of her fateful choice began with a soft whisper in her mind, an echo of self-doubt gradually blossoming into a clamor for validation that grew louder with each passing day. In the days that followed that fateful Tuesday, Elinor replayed every exchanged look, every second of hesitation, and her own quiet complicity in the convergence of fate, like actors in a tragic play rehearsed for too long. Was it a disaster orchestrated by some unseen hand, some malevolent force in the universe, or was it merely the painful consequence of her own blindness? As shadows stretched longer and longer, she often found herself rooted at the very scene of the crime, an old, dimly lit bookstore wedged unceremoniously at the corner of Maple and Elm. On that fateful day, the intoxicating scent of pages ripe with untold stories enveloped her, intoxicating yet suffocating, wrapping her in an embrace that felt both comforting and oppressive. The armchair philosophers and poets lined the walls like sentinels, and in that dim glow, she stumbled upon a choice wrapped ever so discreetly inside a whispered secret that seemed to beckon her forward. "Don't you want something more than this?" Nathan had asked, his voice smooth like the finest whiskey, leaning closer to her, the conspiratorial fire dancing brightly in his eyes. "Grant yourself the freedom to explore." His words seduced her restless spirit, engulfing her ambition, like a silk scarf too beautiful to resist, yet laden with the hefty and unforeseen consequences that would soon follow. Determined to be more than merely an office manager, bound to a mundane existence of perfunctory tasks and routines, Elinor was drawn inexorably to the thrill of rebellion and the tantalizing allure of his promise. They could take wild risks, dance on the precarious edge of societal expectations, and discover the vibrant hues of life that existed just beyond the mapped confines of her dull life. Yet hindsight unraveled that once bright ribbon of longing into something much darker, a noose tightening around her conscience with every passing day. Time slipped away rapidly, flowing through her fingers like quicksilver, elusive and ungraspable. Guilt seeped deeply into her veins, beginning as a torturous itch that now morphed into a hideous infection she could hardly ignore. How inexorable was the shift from light to shadow. A seemingly innocuous flirtation spiraled into a betrayal that altered her world fundamentally, leaving shards of shattered trust strewn across the landscape of her life. The evening she had betrayed David, her quiet husband, clung heavily to her thoughts like a shroud she could not shake. Instead of diligently filing reports as promised, she had succumbed to the spark ignited by Nathan's enticing words. Stepping outside, her arms tightly crossed against her body, in defiance of the chill in the air, she had abandoned the monotonous humdrum of her existence under the guise of pursuing something that she foolishly thought might be meaningful. She recalled the crisp air whispering freedom, a soft, sharp, but cruel rebuke to her stagnant status quo. Elation blossomed in her heart, yet choked her breath when she finally opened the door to Nathan's apartment that evening. David, the gentle and loving man who once held her heart untainted by doubt and betrayal, awaited her return home. "I missed you," he murmured softly, his voice sweet and simple, laced with an affection that had become a comforting yet suffocating prison. But the look in his eyes as she crossed the threshold made her feel as though she wore chains instead of the silk blouse that draped elegantly over her body. a prison of her own deeply flawed making. With each interaction she had with David, her choices' haunting presence grew ever more pronounced. Nathan desired her in a primal way, yet their dalliance felt painfully hollow and empty once the thrill and excitement faded beneath the weight of her conscience. Insidious whispers echoed through her mind, amplifying her inner turmoil. Was it love or mere fleeting lust? The lines blurred with both time and urgency, until clarity vanished like a ghost slipping through her fingers, leaving her lost and bewildered, eyes downcast beneath the weight of her repeated and damning decisions. Days morphed into weeks, blurring together in a display of monotonous despair. She attempted to bury the gaping wound of her emotional transgression beneath mundane activities and trivial distractions, but the gnawing need for redemption loomed endlessly overhead, sinister like a specter haunting her every move. Doubts burrowed under her skin, taking root as firmly as weeds in an abandoned and neglected garden. The truth lingered, demanding passionate recognition, a sapphire glint in the darkness of her despair, relentlessly refusing to evade the light. Elena resolved to meet Nathan once more, a calculated risk thought to ease the overwhelming burden she felt within. However, that encounter forced her to confront the contradictions she had feigned ignorance to, revealing the depths of her self-deception. In the dim light of his apartment, Elena came to understand the fragile connection they shared, a connection now splintered and frayed, shards of choices that cut deep into her very being. David's eyes saw through her mask of bravado, carrying her guilt with a piercing profundity that made her heart ache. The air grew stale and thick, trapping Elena in repetitive loops of self-condemnation and regret. Denial clawed viciously at her insides, tempting her to believe that the misstep could somehow resolve itself, that if she simply avoided scrutiny, then the harsh truth might wash away, like the tide receding silently from the shore. Yet fate cruelly forced her to face reality, pushing her towards acceptance. One evening, chilled by a shroud of trepidation after she learned of the fateful accident, horror erupted within her as the news broke violently from the depths of her anxieties. Nathan, who once promised adventure beyond the mundane shackles of their lives, lay lifeless in a narrow alley not far from her doorstep. Just like that, her previously black and white existence unraveled tragically into a cacophony of emotions tearing at her very resolve. Guilt coiled tighter around her heart, squeezing the breath from her lungs, rendering her utterly powerless. At the funeral, distant and numb, ensnared by guilt and remorse for her choices, she recognized in despair the ramifications of her decisions laid bare for all to see. Each soul passing through the long line of mourners illuminated the choice she had severed irrevocably, thrusting her deeper into the vast and dark abyss of her moral decay. Once she had harbored glorious dreams of an exciting life beyond the confines her choices had woven into her existence, yet here she stood, a mere shadow of the woman she had once aspired to become. David unknowingly held the delicate thread of her redemption, the comforting wraps of warmth encircling her chilling despair like a fragile embrace. "If only I could have seen their last moments, said goodbye," he murmured, tenderness mocking her inner turmoil, digging a knife deeper into her already bleeding heart. The irony fueled her self-loathing, intensifying her shame. When he spoke of Nathan, it felt as if she were clawing at an invisible force trying desperately to retain her self-worth, yet she was slipping irrevocably away. The spiral deepened over the following agonizing weeks. Grief manifested itself in splintered thoughts incapable of coherence, and Elena clung desperately to distant memories shared with both men, fragments of her past that felt like ghosts haunting her. Days blurred into nights, with time stretching outwards in labyrinthine tangents created by regret, seeping relentlessly into every aspect of her daily routine. The notion of redemption felt like a ghost, persistent, yet always just a step ahead, never allowing her even a fleeting moment of solace or peace. Evenings became the worst for her. Solitude deepened into relentless introspection, where daily rituals morphed into haunting reenactments, burdening her already weary soul. Each sunset retold lavish desires she could have embraced, paired with resplendent nights that masked her decisions in an alluring veil of mystery. It became a tragic game of perpetual self-destruction. Her thoughts ricocheted against the mirror of her distorted memories until she barely recognized the haunting figure she'd become. When she finally stood precariously at the precipice, hovering over the abyss of despair, she could no longer flee from the heavy hand of responsibility. One devastating decision had entwined itself around her heart, forging a tapestry of inevitable consequence that she could not escape. The moral weight pressed down upon her unbearably, with the weight of fate clinging to her soul. For every misstep, avoidance had become a toxic seed festering and growing into bitter fruit that she could not discard. Perhaps it was during the darkest hour, however, that she uncovered a truth obscured by layers of denial. Choices ripple endlessly through time, Each crashing wave birthed new realizations, revealing how irrevocable and unyielding her path truly was. Like dominoes falling under invisible pressure, the finality of her situation seized her troubled thoughts. Elinor finally had to face a truth that was as dark and palpable as the air surrounding her. The world spun disorientingly as she stepped away from the edge of despair, her breath stabilizing yet interrupted by jagged pangs of guilt that continued to tear at her peace. She traversed the fleeting spaces between regret and acceptance, while shadows lengthened persistently around her, refusing to release their rigid grasp on the lost potential of her being. They whispered sinister reminders tied closely to her choice, and she continued to live in the harrowing knowledge that whatever lay ahead was pulled relentlessly by the strings of her own moral injury. Eventually, Elinor returned to the very bookstore where her encounter had shattered the pieces of her life, hoping to find the clarity that had once eluded her among the words that had inspired her spirit long ago. Rows upon rows of novels lined the shelves, tales rich with their own moral consequences and bittersweet stories. Each hesitant step into that hallowed space washed uncertainty over her like a tidal wave crashing down upon a fragile shore, met by the quiet resolve of the book's spine standing tall. Placing a trembling hand on the cover of a beloved volume, a story beckoning her with promises of redemption and understanding, she questioned, could there ever be redemption for her choices? Would sweeping the echoes of her actions under the world of fiction somehow exorcise the demons that clung so stubbornly to her very thoughts? The stillness of the moment weighed heavily upon her, testifying to her inner conflict, a battle between her haunting past and her unwilling acceptance of her present reality. The weight of her choices hung in the air like the scent of old pages, familiar yet excruciating in its reflection of what she had irrevocably severed from her life, and who she could potentially relinquish in harmony with the tumultuous world around her. In that quiet corner where enlightenment and despair coexisted, the light flickered once more. Though shadows lengthened ominously, she realized that resolution, whatever form it might eventually take, would bind her reality to her choices, a fickle tether, inexorably braided into the fabric of her existence. Perhaps it would always remain unfinished, an open-ended question bleeding endlessly into the universe, allowing her to ponder the vivid colors of her faded dreams that